So first thing, couple business points. I have still not heard back from the, dean about whether we've met our vaccine quotas. So as of right now, our Tuesday class is going to be Zoom again. And because I said I would give you a week's notice, as of right now, so next week will certainly be on Zoom. As soon as I hear anything more, we'll move it back to in person as soon as we find out. So again, Zoom again on Tuesday, and then we do not have class next Thursday. But for now, still on Zoom. And again, I will continue to keep these Zoom recordings going all semester, even if we go back to in person. So that's that. Secondly, the homework. You had a homework due today because of all the holidays and all the various other things. You might not have gotten it in. Get it to me ASAP. I haven't had a chance to grade them yet. So as long as you turn them in, I don't know, by tomorrow, I'm going to start grading them either tomorrow afternoon or Saturday morning. So just get them to me ASAP. I won't take off points because it's the start of the semester. But then going forward, I'm going to switch back and I'm going to start making sure that I'm going to start grading the homeworks on Mondays so we can talk about them in class on Tuesdays. So just make sure to keep up with the syllabus, and I will keep talking about this stuff going forward. But we're going to talk about the homework that was due today in class on Tuesday. So again, if you haven't had a chance to do it yet, get it done ASAP. We're going to go over it Tuesday, and I'll be getting them back to you this weekend. Any questions, comments, concerns, feelings at this point? Also, I've switched classrooms again because I couldn't find the one I was in last time. So the light is like extra harsh. So if it's bothering your eyes or anything, just let me know and I'll try to find a different classroom next time. I'm just literally just finding empty classrooms to teach from. So yeah, but at least it's got these nice whiteboards. All right, anyway, if we don't have any more questions, I'm gonna jump right into the material. And to do that, let's start with, what did we talk about last time? What was the main focus of last class? Which would have been, I guess, last
Argument.
Thursday. Say that again.
Argument.
Arguments, yes. Arguments. And what did we say arguments were? Or how did we define them? Or what were the parts that went into them? Anyone remember? Arguments, premises. So arguments were made up of two things, premises, and then what was the other part?
Conclusion.
Conclusion, yeah. Arguments are made up of premises and conclusions. And what we said an argument was basically just a way of writing down in like step-by-step form exactly how you would go about thinking to gain new information or to convince somebody else to believe something that they didn't have before. So all an argument was just a set of statements, each of which could be true or false, that together are being used to convince someone or support a conclusion, which is a different statement, which can be true or false. So that's the general idea. And examples of this were just things like, premise one, all dogs have fur. Premise two, Fido is a dog. Conclusion, Fido has fur. And that's all an argument is just these premises reaching a conclusion. Any questions about this stuff from last time? Either stuff that came up for you on the homework that you wanted to ask. Again, we're gonna go over the homework in detail next week, so don't worry about details on the homework, just if you had any big picture general questions. All right, so one thing that I want to say before we move on is that, and this is something we're going to come back to later on in a bit more detail, but the relationship between premises and conclusions only apply for a particular argument. So if you have in this particular case that Fido has fur is the conclusion, but what serves as the conclusion in one line of reasoning or in one argument can then be a premise in another argument. So for instance, this one's the bottom. Fido has fur So if this was the conclusion before, this could now be a premise to a different conclusion. Fido has fur. Premise 2, fur keeps something warm. So conclusion, Fido is warm. So do you see how the same exact sentence as we had over here, Fido has fur, it was the conclusion of this argument. The very same statement can now be the premise in a different argument. And really what a premise or a conclusion is just a matter of how it's being used. They're just statements that are either true or false about the world. So this very same statement or fact can both serve as the input to learning new things, or it can be the conclusion you draw from some old things that you already know. So I just want to make that clear, and we'll be talking more about this later on, but it's just something to highlight. What a premise or conclusion is just like the, to use the analogy I'm going to be going back to, just like with cooking, you can make something like, I don't know, if you're making a salad, you can roast some walnuts, and those walnuts are the end product of your first step of cooking. But they can then, toasted almonds or toasted walnuts can then be an input or can be one of the ingredients for the next thing you cook. In the same way, what was a conclusion before can now be a premise in something else. So that's something I just want to highlight. And whether something's a conclusion or a premise depends on the particular argument that we're discussing at that point. So we all good here? All right, let me erase this. And I now want to move on to what our main topic is of today. Last time we were discussing arguments in general. This time we are going to be discussing good arguments. What makes an argument a good one, or what makes a line of reasoning good reasoning? And the reason that this is important is that, remember what we said last time, the point of reasoning or the point of arguments is to understand how to gain new knowledge or new pieces of information on the basis of the other ones, if it makes the other person react. So yeah, another reason we want to do it is we want to convince other people to believe things. And the way this isn't going to work unless you know how to do it well. So what I'm going to talk about today is the two things that go into reasoning well, or into a good argument. Because remember, an argument is just writing down step by step what a line of reasoning is. So in the same way, you can write down the steps of cooking. But what that really is a way of like writing down what you actually do. So you write down stir the pot, but really that corresponds to the act of moving something. In the same way, you write down the premises that you begin thinking and the conclusion that you ultimately think. But the argument is just corresponding to a thought process that a person could have. So when you're cooking, and again, I like this analogy a lot because I think you can think of gaining knowledge as cooking yourself new information or cooking up new knowledge. And so in the same way, you can use our analogy of cooking to understand what it is we're doing. So when you're cooking, we talked about this last time, what two things go into successfully cooking? There's two different types of things you have to do or have to have.
Ingredients.
You need to have the ingredients, and also along with ingredients, I'm going to include tools. So there's like the stuff you need to actually do the cooking. And then what's the other thing you need? I think somebody said
The method.
Yeah, you need the method or the recipe or the steps. So I'm going to put up your method / steps. So yeah, just the
I don't know if it's just me, but your camera is going out of focus.
Oh, yeah, I'm going blurry. Give me a second. Let me stop the video and then restart it. This usually works. Are we back?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
I'll try to stay. Nope, we just lost it again. This is fun. I think it's because the light in this room is so bright, it doesn't know what to do. Okay, I'm just gonna stay very still and not move. So when you're cooking, yeah, it's the ingredients and the steps. In the same way with an argument, you have the input or the things you start with, and then the way you combine them. So if we say the ingredients are what you start with when you're cooking, anyone have any thoughts of what the equivalent of that would be in an argument? What is it that you begin with when you're trying to gain new knowledge?
I guess it would be like the who, what, where, I guess like the main details.
So and before though you're going with those details, where are you getting that? So if here's a new thing, I should eat pizza. What would lead you to this conclusion? What sort of things might you think that would lead you to this?
I'm hungry, so
I'm hungry.
a mental active process. The invisible thing that goes, I don't know how to explain it.
So imagine you've got, this is your train of thought. I'm hungry, there's pizza there, like right there. I should eat pizza. This is just an argument. And if this is the conclusion you're reaching, and these are the things you're starting with, what's that P word we've just been using?
Premises.
Yeah, these are your premises. So in an argument, in food, the ingredients are, the pure, sugar, flour, tomatoes, etc. In an argument, the ingredients are, I don't want to move too far from this point, so I'm right on this side, equals premises. Is this on screen? Yeah. So in the case of an argument, the thing you begin with, your ingredients are the premises. And then the method you use is the way they get combined together in the same way as with when you're cooking. So it's going to be the relationship between premises / the form of the argument. And I'll talk more in a few moments about what this notion of a form of an argument means. But in the same way, it's a matter of cooking well comes down to what you start with and how well you combine them together. In an argument, whether you're reasoning well comes down to what you begin with, what premises you start with, and how you combine those premises together. And if you do it well, in the same way, if you succeed when cooking, you end up with a good meal. When you succeed with reasoning, you're going to end up with new information, new knowledge, something that can help you in your life. So in the case of ingredients, it's pretty straightforward. What makes an ingredient good or bad? It has to do with all sorts of things that I don't want to talk about because this isn't a cooking class. But with a premise, what we're going to talk about first is basically what makes a good premise. What is it, if you're reasoning well, what is it that makes something a good premise? So if we said before that what the goal of reasoning is to take things that you know or information that you have that's accurate to then learn new things, get to know more information. What is going to make a premise a good premise? What is it that makes it a useful thing for getting a new conclusion? Just intuitively here, given what the definition of reasoning is. If the goal is to get new information from old information, what makes information good?
That it's credible.
It's credible. Or in the best possible situation would be what?
It's true.
It's true.
True. Yeah. So when we're talking about premises in an argument, you get an argument presented to you. And your first step is to assess whether the premises it has are good. Well, what you're looking for is, are these premises true? Because the goal is to start with knowledge you have or things you know, and then reach new conclusions. Or if you don't know for certain that it's true, is it at least very credible or very plausible? So to go with a simple argument, if we're going that way. I'm not used to having all these boards, so it's going to be, a bit chaotic at times. If you have an argument that looks like this, I'm in Baruch right now. Baruch is in Manhattan. Conclusion, I'm in Manhattan. So these are the two, this is an argument you could be presented with. Somebody asks, where is the professor even teaching from? And somebody says, oh, he's in Baruch, and Baruch's in Manhattan. So I guess the borough he's in right now is Manhattan. So this is a case in which these are your two premises, 1, 2, and that's your conclusion. So when you're assessing these premises, are these things true, or at the very least credible? Would these be good premises for this
Yes.
conclusion?
Yeah.
They are. You have no reason to doubt when I say that I'm in Baruch, I'm in Baruch. And if Baruch, like, it's also, you having been here on campus before, you know it is in fact true that Baruch College is in Manhattan. Therefore, these are both good premises. Bad premises are just anything that isn't believable or you have no good reason to think. So if I tell you that, last night I stayed up late drinking bleach, it's probably not the case that that's a true statement. Why? Well, because bleach will kill you if you drink it in large quantities, and I'm seemingly still alive. And so the first step in an argument is always just to assess the quality of the premises. And in a lot of cases, it's easy, and in some cases, it's difficult. And one of the ways you have to assess premises, and this is what we'll get to in a little bit, is that sometimes assessing the truth or credibility of a premise involves coming up with another argument in support of that premise. So this is what we'll talk about more in a couple classes. But the idea basically is you check your ingredients by just seeing, are they true? Or at the very least, is it very likely that they're true? So another thing that you might, here's another argument in which the premise is not necessarily 1000% for certain true, but it's very credible. The sun will rise tomorrow. If the sun rises, it will be bright. Therefore, it will be bright tomorrow. So these premises, are they good premises? Well, first off, let's talk about this first one. The sun will rise tomorrow. Is this 100% guaranteed to be true?
No.
No. What could happen tonight?
Like an asteroid could hit us and then.
Exactly. An asteroid could hit us and the Earth could be exploded, or we could blow ourselves up in nuclear war, or the sun could implode. So we don't know for certain that the sun will rise tomorrow. We can't say with absolute certainty that it's true. However, it's really, really likely. Therefore, we can say that this is, even if we don't have 100% certainty that it's true, we can use that as a good premise. So does everyone understand how this is why we say that a premise must be credible or believable or plausible? And ideally, it is true. Ideally, all your premises are true, but not everything in the world you know for certain. And in this class, as we go along, we'll find out other things that we usually take for granted that we can't absolutely know for certain. But this is the general idea.
Sorry. So you're saying that a premise is valid even if it's not like 100% provable. So you're saying that like the sun will rise tomorrow is a valid premise?
Don't use the word valid to describe a premise for the simple reason of that's totally normal everyday talk. But in philosophy, we are going to use the word valid to mean a very, very particular thing, in the same way that like in a science class, mass means something very specific and weight means something very specific and volume means something very specific. In philosophy, valid means something very specific. So don't use the word valid here, but say it's a good premise or an acceptable premise. And now we're going to talk about why we can't use valid, because that's a different one. But you're 100% right in your general point of a premise can be a good one, even if we're not 100% certain it's true, as long as we have good reason to think it might be true and no good reason to think it's not true.
Got it. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. So that's the first bit of an argument. And in some ways, it's the easier part. And in other ways, it's the harder part. Because a lot of times, what we're going to find is that we are very tempted to accept premises even if we don't have good reason to do so because of certain psychological factors. And we're going to be talking about those a lot more later in the semester. But for instance, things like conspiracy theories. We as a species are very tempted to believe conspiracy theories, even though if you actually take a step back and look at the premises behind a conspiracy theory, very often the data is not very good. So for instance, the conclusion that COVID was made in a lab is usually, if you actually look at that conclusion and then you look at the arguments that led to that, what you find is the premises aren't really that believable. Like, my mother read about it on Facebook. That's not a good reason to conclude something. There's no good reason to conclude from that your mother read about it on Facebook. Maybe that's true, but maybe she didn't read about it, or Facebook, the internet told me so, or the internet says it's true. That's not a good way to reach a conclusion. So we'll be talking more and more about why we sometimes, even if a premise isn't a good one, we tend to believe it. But the second part that goes into an argument, and the part I want to focus on for the rest of class, because we'll be talking about the premise bit a bit more later on. The part we're going to be talking about with the structure, or the other half, is the argument valid? And what validity is, and valid is the adjective and the noun is validity. The way to think of it is the structure good? And the way you can think of this in comparison to our cooking class, or our cooking analogy, when you're cooking, whether or not you end up with a good meal is not if you end up with a good meal, odds are you cooked well. But you can be, by pure dumb luck, accidentally cook a good meal. On the flip side, just because you end up with something that tastes terrible does not mean that you're a bad cook, because other factors. So what you want to do when you're trying to assess if you're good at cooking is you want to separate out the things you have control over. You want to actually just look at your process. Don't just focus on the end product, but instead focus on how you're actually going about the steps. In the same way, when you're looking at arguments, you want to learn to recognize when the steps of reasoning you take are good, and treat that as separate from whether you actually reach a true conclusion. Because while your goal is ultimately to reach a true conclusion, getting to a true conclusion and reasoning well are not always the same. So we're going to talk about this more with some examples, but that's the general idea here, is that what we want to talk about now is, in the same way, when you learn to cook, you are learning the methods to do it, not necessarily that you're guaranteed to create a great meal every time. In the same way, we want to learn how to tell whether your arguments are good and a good way to go about thinking, not necessarily that we want to learn how to get truths consistently. We have to learn the methods of doing it, not just directly going to getting a true statement at the end. So I want to jump up and down on this analogy of cooking. If you want to tell whether a recipe is good or not, how do you go about finding that out? You want to know if you're a good cook.
By
What do you do?
tasting the food?
Yeah, you taste the food at the end. You taste the food. And if it tastes good, that's probably an indication that you were a good chef. But if the food tastes terrible, does that necessarily mean you did something wrong?
Yes.
But what does it mean, though, that your process was wrong? Like the
No.
actual folding and cooking and everything else?
No.
Or what? Wait, say that again?
No, I don't think so.
No, what could have gone wrong?
Maybe you just don't like it.
Maybe you don't like it, or say not just that you don't like it. Imagine that it is something you like.
Maybe you didn't have the best ingredients.
There we
Yeah.
go. That's the one. You could, if you cook with rotten chicken, it doesn't matter if you're the best chef in the world, it's going to taste terrible. In the same way, in an argument, even if you reason in the perfect way, it's not necessarily a guarantee that your conclusion is going to be great. So what we need to do to test whether or not a food or your recipe or your method is good, you start with good ingredients and see if the ingredients are good, is the meal good? If no matter how good your ingredients are, if you just can't cook, it's gonna always taste terrible. And if you have the highest end ingredients and it still tastes terrible, then here's evidence that you're not a good cook. But if you only have access to really cheap ingredients that taste bad, you're never gonna learn if you're actually a good chef. In the same way, with an argument, to learn what good arguing looks like, we begin by assuming that the premises are good or that the premises are true. And then we see if this is true, is our conclusion going to be true as well? Or is our conclusion going to be almost certainly true as well? So when you're cooking, you assume that you have good ingredients, then you go through, and if it tastes good at the end, you're a good chef. You've done a good job. With reasoning, you start with true or credible premises, or you simply assume they're credible, and then you reason through. And if the thing you reach at the end would be true if the other things are true, then it's a good argument. So let me show an example here, just to make this make a little more sense. This is going to be an argument in which, let's see what happens if we assume the premises are true. Let's just do this Baruch one. In Baruch, premise 2, Baruch is in Manhattan. Conclusion, I'm in Manhattan. So if you were to think in this way, are you doing a good job? So intuitively or commonsensically, is this a good way of reasoning? If you think this first and you think this second, and together they cause you to believe this, is that a good way of thinking? Just common sense. Yeah, it is. And now we can now put this in philosophy terms and say, how can we know this is a good way of thinking? Well, if this is true, which as a matter of fact it is, and this is true, is it possible for this to not be true? Is it possible for us to believe something that's false?
No.
No. If this is true and this is true, this must be true. Another way of putting this is this cannot be false. The conclusion cannot be false if the premises are true. This is what we call in philosophy valid. And valid is a matter of how does the argument hold together. And an argument is valid by definition if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Or another way of putting it is, if you assume the premises are true, then is the conclusion guaranteed to be true? If so, we say the argument as a whole is valid. If not, we say the argument as a whole is invalid. So to give an example of an invalid argument, here's one. I have teeth. All dogs have teeth. Conclusion, I'm a dog. So, given the definition of, so first off, what's the definition of validity? I just said it like 3 different ways, but I want to hammer it home again. What is it for an argument to be valid? What is the definition here?
But the conclusion can't be false if the premises are true.
Spot on, Netta. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be false. So to test if this argument is valid, what do? Well, we assume for the sake of argument that both of these things are true. Assume, as a matter of fact, that I have, or just assume for the sake of argument that I have teeth. That's true. Now also assume for the sake of argument that all dogs have teeth. That's probably not true as a matter of fact, because there's probably some really old dogs who all their teeth fell out. But let's assume that all dogs do have teeth. Then is it possible that I'm not a dog? Is it possible for this to be false?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. I am actually a counterexample to this. And by counterexample here, I just mean one instance that shows a general statement isn't true. So as a matter of fact, I do have teeth, and yet I'm not a dog. even in a world in which all dogs have teeth, I'm still not going to be a dog. So this is what we say is an invalid argument. So what we're trying to do here is isolate from the truth of the premises, just how can you tell if a line of reasoning is good? And the way you go about it is you can put the premises to the sides, because no matter how good your premises are, if you're not reasoning in the right way, the conclusion is going to be false. Or at the very least, you're not going to be certain that the conclusion is true. So we try to learn the method of doing this so that in the future, when we actually learn something, we can be certain that the things we're learning are good. But before we're in a position to do that, we need to learn the methods. So this is what it is for something to be valid. An argument is valid just where if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So let's go with another one here. And this is going to be a tricky one just because it kind of goes against our common sense understanding of the word valid. But is the following argument valid? Neely is a vampire. All vampires drink blood. Conclusion, therefore, David Neely drinks blood. So, is this argument valid in the philosophy sense? V-A-L-I-D, not in the common sense of is the conclusion guaranteed to be true, but is it true in the philosophy sense? So how do we test if it is? Or answer my question, either one. Is this valid?
I think
From
it's
my
valid.
understanding, using the definition that you gave, it's valid.
Correct. Given the definition, this is a valid argument. Because how would we tell? Well, we first just assume that this is true and this is true. So we assume that it is true that I'm a vampire. And we assume it's true that all vampires drink blood. Well, if those two things are true, if we assume they're true, then you cannot have, it wouldn't be possible for me to not drink blood. So this is a case of, this is where our notion of validity in philosophy comes apart from our common sense one. And so why do we care about this philosophy version? Well, again, as we're going to be talking about more next time, you have to learn the ways of doing it. And if you know how to reason well, you can reason in separate from any particular sorts of premises. You want to be able to think like the method of doing it. A person who's a really good chef should be able to stir things well, even if their ingredients are terrible, because they know how to stir well. A very good basketball player will be able to shoot a basketball well, no matter whether you fill the basketball with water or you put them on a trampoline or anything like that. In the same way, with reasoning, you want to be able to reason well, regardless of the particular premises you're given. And a good reasoner will be able to assess the quality of the structure of the argument independent of what the particular premises are. And if you can do that, you'll be much, much better at thinking clearly. Now, another term to write down is sound. Now, if an argument is valid and its premises are true, then we say it is a sound argument. So this here is a valid argument, but it is not a sound argument because it is not actually like, this is not a believable premise that I'm a vampire. So in this case, it is not sound because the first premise is not credible, is not believable. If we change this to David Neely is a human and all humans have blood, and then we have, therefore, David Neely has blood. Now, this is a case. Is this argument valid?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And what I just showed here, just by switching those around, is you can see that every single valid argument, the structure of any argument of this sort of so-and-so is a blank, all blanks have blank, all humans have blood. Conclusion, therefore so-and-so has blood. Anytime you see an argument of that form, it's going to be valid. And this is useful because now anytime you come across something of this form ever in your life, you will know that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Now, in this case, are these premises true? Am I a human? Or at the very least, is it credible that I'm a human?
Yes.
Yeah. Is it credible that all humans have blood?
Yes.
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 Therefore, not only is it valid, it's also the premises are true. Therefore, in this case, it is sound. And a sound argument is what you're ultimately looking for. But to learn to identify sound arguments, you have to learn what validity is. And again, what the definition of validity is if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And we're going to be hammering this home a lot more next class, where we're going to be looking at particular formulas of arguments that are valid, just very common ones. And then what we're going to do the class after is look at more complicated argument forms, so we can assess whether these things are valid or not valid, or invalid, I should say. So does everyone understand this general idea of validity? And I think once we do a few more classes, it'll make a little more sense about why we should give a damn about this stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Any
sound,
questions? Oh, say that again.
I'm gonna say, so sound arguments, the premises are always true.
Yes.
Or,
By definition, a sound argument is the premises are true and the structure is
Okay.
valid. So
Okay.
just to put it up here, these are the things that you can have as an argument. I'm going to put up like a little bar chart. You can have true premises, true slash good premises, bad premises, valid or invalid. Valid. So if you have an argument that is both true slash good premises and is valid, then it's sound. This would be an argument that is we call this invalid. Usually we don't bother differentiating between these, but an invalid argument, these are the ones that are very tricky, and oftentimes you might find yourself being persuaded by. So these are arguments of a form like, I'm trying to think, politics usually gives you a good one. I know somebody who is, or something like, I know someone on welfare who's lazy, therefore everyone on welfare is lazy. That's an argument in which, even if it is true that you know someone on welfare who's lazy, that does not justify or allow you to draw the conclusion that everybody on welfare is lazy. So this would be a case in which, even if your premises are true, if the argument is invalid, you're not guaranteed to reach a good conclusion. Now, if an argument has bad premises and is invalid, it's just like an absolute disaster of an argument, and very few times are you going to come across that. So that would be a case of something like, all pigs can fly. John is a pig. John can swim. Conclusion, John can swim. So premise one, premise two. This is just a disaster of an argument. Pigs can't fly. John isn't a pig. He's my best friend who's a human. And it has nothing to do with the conclusion. So this is just a disaster of an argument. But then you can also have valid arguments that have bad or false premises. And that's like the vampire argument. And so these two are both valid. This is our ideal. But to learn to recognize these, we want to be able to recognize these sorts of arguments as well. And then to recognize that, to make sure that you're not tricked by believable premises into reaching a conclusion you don't want to draw. So basically, you want to learn to recognize these so you can differentiate this from this. And we're going to talk about this more throughout the semester. But basically, if the ideal is to always think sound arguments and to recognize when arguments are sound and only believe the sound ones, then you want to be able to recognize when an argument is valid, but it's got crappy premises, and also arguments in which the premises are true, but you still shouldn't believe the conclusion. So does this all make sense to everybody thus far? And again, if it's not making 100% sense, we're going to go over it more on Tuesday, and then we'll be doing this stuff for the whole semester. But does everyone feel comfortable enough to move on at this point?
Yes.
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 Awesome. All right. Now, I've been a little bit, the best way of putting this, I've been a little bit, I've been ignoring half the stuff. Basically, there's two types of reasoning, deductive and inductive. And I've just been talking about deductive reasoning. And the definition of deductive reasoning, or the way to recognize it, is this is the type of reasoning that uses words like all, some. And these types of arguments are ones where, when they're valid, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. If premises true, conclusion must be true. But that's not the only way we gain new information. We don't just do it by knowing what all of something are like, or what some of something, or what a particular individual is. What's another way in which we gain information? So to go to our example from before, how many of you are pretty damn confident, or would be, if I gave you $1,000 and I told you, you can bet this $1,000 and I will double it if you're right. And the question is, will the sun rise tomorrow? How many of you would be willing to bet that yes, the sun will rise tomorrow?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah. Hopefully most of you would be willing to bet it, because it's very likely the sun's going to rise tomorrow. How, though, did you come to the conclusion that the sun's going to rise tomorrow? What's your evidence for this?
Because it happened every single day until now.
Exactly. This is what we call an inductive argument. An inductive argument is an argument that draws on past experience to draw conclusions about the future. So in this particular case, what an argument for is the sun, so if our conclusion is sun will rise tomorrow, the premises of this inductive argument are premise one, it rose today. Premise two, it rose yesterday. Premise three, etc., etc., etc. So this is what an inductive argument is. Now, an inductive argument is not valid in the same way that a deductive argument is. And that's because, as we said before, even if the sun rose every single day up to this point in the history of the world, it's not 100% a guarantee. This is not 100, these ones can be true. It is, all of this is true, but there's always a like 0.00001% chance that it doesn't rise tomorrow because it blows up or something like that. So when we say that an inductive argument is valid, what we mean is that the past evidence for it happening is such that it's a very, very, very high percentage that it's going to happen in the future. So with an inductive argument, it's not absolute certainty, but it's very, 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 very likely. So there are plenty of arguments of things in which we can point to times in which we use past experience. If I let go of this marker, will it fall? Well, again, we're using past experience. And the argument that yes, it will fall because I've seen it fall every other time, that is a valid inductive argument. An invalid inductive argument, well, if a valid inductive argument is one in which there's a lot of past experience that suggests your conclusion is true. Anyone have a guess about what an invalid inductive argument would be? What would be a bad inductive way of reasoning? What's a bad way of using past experience to draw conclusions about the future?
Wasn't it kind of like the crow one when we were reading that like all the crows are black? When I saw it before, then that means that the next crow I see is going to be black.
So that is one where it really comes down to, well, if you've seen 1,000 crows in your life, is your guess that the next one is going to be black? Does that seem like a good guess?
Yes.
Yeah, it seems good because you've seen a lot of crows. What is something that's was a very rare thing to see?
A good DC movie.
Say that again.
It's really rare to see a good DC Comics movie.
All right, so yeah, so imagine if you reason like this. You say, what good DC comic movies are there? I guess,
The Last Suicide Squad, that's it.
okay, so let's say I saw the most recent Suicide Squad, and it was good. Therefore, I draw the conclusion that Spider-Man versus Batman was a good movie. And my evidence is the most recent DC is good. Therefore, every other DC movie must be good as well. Is that a good way of reasoning? What's the difference between that case and this inductive case of the sun rising? What's the difference between the sun rising case and the using your most recent DC movie to draw a conclusion about all the other DC movies?
You're just using that one experience.
Exactly. So an invalid inductive argument is one in which the evidence that you're using, the past experience, is very, very small. So for instance, if anybody can get lucky one time. So if, for instance, I were to take this marker and just throw it and somehow miraculously it's stuck in the wall. And then from that, I concluded that every time I throw a marker, it's also going to stick in the wall. That is not a good argument because I only have one piece of evidence for it. In the same way, if your friend cooks you a good meal one time, it's not a guarantee that they're a good chef. If they do it over and over again, then you know they're a good chef. Anybody can make a basketball in a hoop one time. A good player does it a lot. So a valid inductive argument is one in which you do it. There are many, many instances you can point to. An invalid one is one where there's not a lot of instances you can point to. So this is just a deductive. You look at to see if it's valid or not. You see if the premises are true, can the conclusion be false? In this case, you look at what your premises are and how many there are, and you see even if the premises are true, how likely is the conclusion? And if you find like, I knew a bad inductive argument would be something like, I knew someone who won the lottery. Conclusion, so I'll probably win the lottery. This is a bad way of reasoning. Or I won the slot machine one time, therefore I'm going to win it again in the future. A bad way of reasoning because one piece of evidence is not enough to make the conclusion a good one. So does this make sense? In an inductive argument where you're drawing on experience, it has to do with how much experience you can draw on to prove your conclusion. Because the more experience you can point to, the more likely the conclusion is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And we are going to be talking about this a lot more next time with some examples and all, but that's the basic gist of it. So just to review everything we've talked about today, give me a second to sip this water. Last time we looked at what arguments are in general. This time we looked at what good arguments are. And to look at what good arguments are, we actually found there are two different types of arguments. There are inductive ones in which the premises are past occasions on which it's occurred, and the conclusion is something about what's going to happen in the future. And a good inductive argument is one in which there are a lot of particular instances, therefore the likelihood of the conclusion happening is very high. A deductive argument is one in which there's often words like if, some, etc. If this is the case, then this is the case. And if A is true, then B is true. A is true, therefore B is true. And we'll give some more examples next time. Or all dogs have fur. Fido is a dog, therefore Fido has fur. These are cases in which for them to be valid, the premises must be if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So what we're going to do next time is look at more particular examples of this. For those who came in late, I have not graded the homework that was due today yet. So if you have not turned it in, get it in ASAP. I will be grading them either tomorrow or Saturday. And then going forward, homeworks will be due on Monday. We'll talk more about that next week. Are there any other questions on anything we covered today?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, if at any point you have questions, comments, concerns, feel free to shoot me an email. That's all I really wanted to cover today. And I will, again, keep you all posted as soon as I hear about going back to in person. We'll have a week break and then we can start seeing each other. But as of right now, I've had no updates from the dean's office.
Professor,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt.
No, you're not interrupting.
For the homework, like you mentioned, I really didn't realize with like the holiday and everything and like the
Yeah,
six
yeah.
classes that I'm taking. So can I get the assignment to you by like Saturday, Sunday?
Yes.
Okay.
And this goes for everyone. Just get it to me. And if it's going to be turned in, like if it's Saturday, either way, just shoot me an email. And this goes for all of you. With the holidays and all, like I'm not going to be strict about this. Just get it to me as soon as you can. Say in the email, time got away from you, and I will not be taking off points on these ones.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I apologize.
Oh, no, it's okay. This stuff
Thank you.
happens. Yeah. All right. In that case, I'm going to stop the recording and tell everyone to have a very good weekend, and I will see everyone on Tuesday.